Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical trivia and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. Today, the Patient Art of Aquam. In Ars Magica, we have 4 elemental arts. The one which fits the system least well is Aquam, and because it doesn't fit the system particularly well, there have been very few Aquam specialists designed during the game. The story of the founders originally didn't explain where the art of Aquam came from. It was assumed to have come from the druid Diadne, so that's why we don't know much about it. And I think perhaps the weakness of the concept behind Aquam is one of the reasons that we never got art-by-art splat books. It's pretty clear what you could do with an Animal book. It's pretty clear what you could have done with an Ignem book before the House Flambeau splat book chapter. But what would we have done with Aquam? Now, in the Free Vanilla Covenant web supplement, we have kind of reused this idea with the Mystery Cult of Nodens, saying that's where the art of Aquam came from. I've also used this a long time ago in Sanctuary of Ice, where I suggested that there was a proto-founder who was interested in the art of Aquam. The proto-founders are the magicians who trained with Bonasages but did not go on to found houses, generally because they were elderly and died during the lengthy process of the setting up of the Order of Hermes. So in Sanctuary of Ice, there was an Aquam practitioner active near Lake Geneva when Bonasages was first putting the order together, and she did not found a tradition in much the same way that Gwerna the Feated or Bernice, the instructress of Yarberton, did not later attend tribunals. Let's look at one facet of the art of Aquam. The spell guidelines say that slightly unnatural water, or liquids, are easier to create than highly unnatural water or liquids. But there's no guideline really as to what counts as slightly or highly unnatural, and those of us who've used Aquam Magi have found that you can use this rule to end run around the magic item creation process by creating highly unnatural liquids that do things that magic items would otherwise do. This water, when you drink it, makes you fly, is a highly unnatural liquid. But should it be permitted? Probably not. How about this liquid itself flies, so if I fill a cauldron with it, I can fly by sitting in the cauldron. You get damp, but you can still fly, and you haven't had to master the many other arts which are usually required for travel magic. Without wanting to stake out the furthest edges of what's possible with the art of Aquam, in this podcast, I'd like to define what a slightly unnatural liquid is. In my own campaigns, a slightly unnatural liquid is a liquid that takes one of the natural properties of water and expands it to an unusual supernatural degree. So let's just work through these natural properties of water and see what can be done with them. The first of them is that water is a solvent. This means that acids are slightly unnatural liquids, rather than being highly unnatural just because they're very effective in combat scenarios. I also allow specific solvents. For example, if you wanted to do a heist by creating a liquid that dissolved silver specifically and flooded the basement of a miser's tower with that liquid, then drained the liquid away, waited for it to evaporate and dug up the silver dust, in my campaign, that would be slightly unnatural and fine. This also allows your character to have a little bit of leeway in terms of non-violently disarming your opponents, because you can create water which is a specific solvent for iron and spray your enemies down so that their gear degrades. Second, water is incredibly heavy. We tend not to think about it as being particularly heavy because it doesn't cohere to shapes, but if you've ever tried working in a building which has a flat roof, particularly during the cyclone season in North Queensland, you'll know that raindrops are essentially pebbles that are slightly friendlier, and that if you wanted to crush something, you could easily do it with a column of water. When editing this podcast, I came back in at this point to mention snow. I've seen snow twice in my life, I believe. I live in Northern Australia, where snow is a thing that happens to other people. However, I believe that if you come from a snowy area, you'll have some sympathy with this idea that water is ridiculously heavy and can be really inconvenient. Water disperses heat, And I'd like to think this is why there are so few water magi around. I think House Flambeau hunted them down and murdered them all. In my own game, if you have a counterspell to an Ignum spell, so long as the counterspell is one size class larger than the Ignum spell is countered. So let's use a more concrete example. Say someone flings a pylon of fire at your character. If you create a spell of the same strength but one size class larger, you can absorb all of the heat from that pylon of fire. This also works with other supernatural fires, meaning that it's particularly good against dragon breath. Water coheres and water adheres, and it would be slightly unnatural water that was more coherent than normal water, which means that it didn't fall apart, which would allow you to use some of the other properties, like weight, more destructively. Water adheres, which means it sticks to things. The stickiness of water makes it particularly dangerous if you can't wipe it off, so if you essentially turn water into glue, that's only slightly unnatural. It's the stickiness of water, the adherence of water, that makes it coat objects. So you could drown someone with even quite a small amount of water merely by making it particularly adherent. Similarly, in many parts of Mythic Europe, it's so cold that if you can keep an opponent wet, you don't really have to do much more to kill them. Particularly adherent water makes keeping an opponent soaked, and therefore hypothermic, trivially simple. Water has high surface tension compared to other liquids. This means that it's not difficult to make water that you can walk on. For example, you merely make water that is highly coherent and not very adherent. Similarly, if you made water which was highly coherent and not particularly adherent, you'd make a particularly smooth surface which you could use for sliding objects or for moving faster yourself. The surface tension of water creates capillary action. That's where water appears to defy gravity by crawling up the sides of things. Water with a very high surface tension would be able to crawl over obstructions and barriers, which would allow you to get it into places where it otherwise wouldn't go. To move on to the concept of ice, ice is unusual in that it's a solid that is larger than the same weight of the equivalent liquid. Because of this, ice floats, because it displaces sufficient water. Most solids don't do this. So a slightly unnatural liquid would be one that created an enormous amount of ice for that slight amount of liquid. The process of creating ice and then melting it back into water and creating ice again over many winters is one of the ways that rock is broken down into tillable soil. So in my campaigns at least, this is one of the ways that magi can go around creating better farmland for themselves, by saturating a field and then freezing, melting, creating a spell that does that for a day. This, in some of the more permeable rocks, causes all of the rock to harmlessly explode and become gravel, and then become sand, which when mixed with biological matter just becomes tillable soil. Ice can also be used as a construction material, particularly if you create ice that's slightly unnatural in that it melts at a slightly higher temperature than usual. It's particularly good for boat making, but if you've seen Disney's Frozen, you know it can be used for all sorts of things. Water doesn't compress. Well, it does technically, but in an engineering sense, water doesn't compress very much, which is very important in the creation of hydraulic power transmissions. That is, a great deal of power can be forced through a column of water if the column of water can be contained. Now, in real-world machines, the problem is containing that pressure in something that won't be destroyed by the pressure within the vessel. In Mythic Europe, of course, magic itself provides the containment mechanism. This means that contained units of water, remembering that water is heavy and coherent, can be used much like rocks or metal. So to revise, water is a solvent, it is adherent, it is coherent. This creates capillary action, water forms ice, water is great at trapping heat and has a high heat of vaporization. Water is heavy, and water does not compress. These features, taken to an extreme, are the defining characteristics of slightly unnatural water.